DJ PK, we're joined once again by Shehan Jeyarajah, national college football writer for CBS Sports. Shehan, good morning.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
We have you on for one reason, and then college football changes so quickly. There's another major story between the time you're booked and you actually come on. Is your head spinning on a regular basis with all the stuff coming your way? This is so not about the games and who the three best quarterbacks are. It's unbelievable.
Well, it's funny, right? Because usually around this time of year, I get like a 3-week break or so. Obviously there's still stuff going on, but like from a game perspective, playoff-wise, you're going from conference championships the first week of December to playoff games were around January. Well, now all of a sudden you've got transfer portal, you got recruiting, you've got coach changes, and then on top of that, we have way more games to talk about. So it's definitely been a hectic year, but it's a lot of fun too.
Yeah, and then you got the Vanderbilt quarterback winning an injunction on JC year doesn't count. I mean, this just opens up something brand new. It's like every year there's something brand new, every month almost. And can you imagine now junior college football is not going to count against eligibility? We've gone from being a situation where it was rigid to now it's just wide open. It's just getting crazier almost by the day.
Yeah, and I think that the big thing, too, is that, I think that college football right now is really struggling for not having sort of a unified governance structure, right? So many of the things that are happening are things that are essentially mandated by the court system or things that are mandated by lawsuits or settlements or any of this stuff. So, no, I will say on the Diego Pavia front, right now, the injunction only applies to Diego himself. It doesn't as yet apply to other junior college players. Now, at the same time, they're eventually going to go to trial. There eventually are going to be hearings. That can change, and it could be expanded to include just about anybody. But right now it's just him. But, again, this is the other piece of it, too, is that even in this case, like, there's so much uncertainty. Like, it's possible, because this is a temporary injunction, that this could be overturned at some point. And what happens all of a sudden if Diego Pavia is suddenly ruled ineligible and Vanderbilt has planned an entire roster around him and maybe has played him in games? Would they have to vacate wins? It's just so unclear what's happening right now, and it just makes for such a confusing time.
Do college football people think that this case is going to prevail? I mean, is it going to go in favor of the athlete and bonus eligibility, or are the old rules going to hold up? Have you talked to people, anybody with a legal background who has some sense of how this might shake out?
Well, I think right now, when it comes to this injunction, right, I mean, one of the big things is they wanted to get a decision soon, and written in the legal filing was the idea of, well, look, I mean, Vanderbilt is going to move on without me if I don't have a decision soon. So I think that they understood the urgency in terms of the courts, understood the urgency of trying to come to a quick clarification. But, I think right now, like, they cited a lot of precedences that we've seen so far in college football in terms of, like, what is the justification for junior college not counting against you? How does it factor in that NIL obviously came to be in 2021 and he wasn't able to get his NIL rights during that time? It's really just unclear right now. And I think, I think right now, like, the thought is at least that Diego Pavia probably will permanently be allowed to play college football for the 2025 season. But I think the question becomes, will there need to be another lawsuit with a little bit more of a broad scope to make something like this happen? Because I think that when you look at what the filing said, Pavia's legal team was very particular that they wanted to make this case about him and not just necessarily an indictment on the entire system at large, probably because, look, especially when it comes to a temporary injunction, it was probably unlikely that the courts would make such a ruling on short notice. But again, now that this precedent has been set to an extent, it's going to be fascinating to see how it kind of moves forward.
I think anytime you invite or include the human element into any form of seedings, you're going to have a level of controversy as opposed to the way the pros do it, where it's bracketed, you finish here, you play there, and away you go. And so we have the committee with the selections, and it gets going here, and I'm excited to see how it plays out over the next few weeks. Did you view anything as far as the bracketing in terms of outrageous or controversial?
Well, I'll tell you what, I think the biggest thing is they got the right 12 teams. I think that these were clearly the 12 that deserved to be in. I think that SMU over Alabama, to me, was not a difficult choice. I mean, heading into that conference championship game, SMU was an 11-1 team in the ACC. They had beaten several teams that are in the top 30 or 40. And look, Alabama had good wins, but they had some really, really bad losses. It was just such an inconsistent team this year. So that's the first piece. I think that they got the top 12 teams in correctly. Seeding-wise, I was a little surprised that Notre Dame ended up as the 7th seed. I thought that maybe they'd have a case at the 6 or 5 seed over Texas or Penn State. But I don't think that it's egregious by any means. I also was a little surprised that SMU moved behind Indiana because I thought that their cases heading into the weekend versus coming out were relatively similar. I mean, I don't know that necessarily Indiana had something on their resume that SMU was just not able to match. But again, this is quibbling over individual spots. I think overall the committee did a pretty good job, and I think this is the right 12.
Texas, Notre Dame, Penn State, Indiana, I don't see good wins on those schedules. I see a lot of wins. I see a good record, but there's not a lot of impressive wins there. Now, Notre Dame's an independent, so set them aside. But for the teams that are in conferences, you think there's going to be a lot of discussion behind the scenes about how to get a better conference schedule, because assuming you can predict who's going to be good and who's going to be bad, which clearly we couldn't do in the Big 12, but assuming someone could do that, that seems to be most of how you get into the large berth in the tournament.
Yeah, I mean, I think that one piece I'm going to be fascinated by is we've had a huge discussion over the past couple of years of the SEC and an 8-game versus a 9-game conference schedule. After this year, I actually think that will be one of the bigger impacts, as I think the SEC will drag their feet even more on trying to move to a 9th game because you had so many teams that picked up multiple losses. And part of this, too, is inevitable, right? Because you have 16 to 18 teams. And the reality is, some teams are just going to have favorable draws. Everybody, of course, is talking about the teams that made the playoffs. Missouri is in the rankings because they didn't have to, they played 2 real games and got destroyed in them. So, I do think that some of this is frankly just going to be inevitable. I think some of it is just going to come down to path. I mean, we talked about it all offseason, right? We felt like Colorado had this brutally tough schedule, and ultimately a lot of the teams that we thought were going to be good in the Big 12, like Oklahoma State and Utah, just weren't. And suddenly that schedule looks a lot different. So I just don't know that there's a lot that can truly be done to address something like this. But I do think that, again, I mean, anything that programs can do to try and make their path more manageable, I think they'll try to do. I will say, though, too, on one front, the message coming from the SEC specifically about Alabama was, well, strength of schedule was not rewarded. And I definitely want to push back on that. The reality is, these SEC teams, Alabama, Ole Miss, South Carolina, I mean, even if you go down to the 2-loss teams that made the field, they were treated more like they kind of were given a mulligan. The 3-loss teams were treated like 2-loss teams. 2-loss teams were treated like 1-loss teams. Heading into the weekend, I mean, Texas as a 1-loss team was treated essentially as an undefeated team. So, they are getting credit for playing and winning these games and having tough schedules. But, I mean, again, I think that one thing that everybody's going to have to learn is, especially in this 16-team SEC where 9 teams have won national championships since 1998, even manageable schedules probably are just going to be a little less manageable when you have to do it every week. And, by the way, when the teams at the top are just not as good as they've been in previous years.
Does moving to a bigger playoff, expanding, I guess is the word, I don't know that it eliminates problems, but it might lessen them, I guess?
Yeah, well, I think that for me, this 12-team playoff to this extent, right, heading in, I think it's been a huge success so far. And just as somebody who's a national reporter, I mean, I can tell you, I've gotten to write about a wider variety and diversity of teams than I really ever have, right? I've gotten to write stuff about Group of 5 contenders who had a chance to make the college football playoff. I got to write about multiple Big 12 teams, ACC teams who were fighting for their spot. And so I think overall, I just feel like it's been a huge win. Now, there are individual tweaks that I think that people are going to struggle with, right? Like you have right now the 3 seed and the 4 seed are the teams that were ranked 9 and 12 in the rankings. You know, we'll have to see how that playoff actually comes to fruition and what the games actually look like before we make any broad declaration. But I do think that that's something that will be a target after the 2025 season when the first round of the playoff contract expands. I also think, too, that we might see a move to 14 or 16 to potentially even kind of lessen the impact of some of these first-round buys specifically, even if we do still have auto bids. But I think overall, like, this system has been a huge success. It kept way more teams involved for way longer than they ever have before, and I'm excited to see it actually get to play out.
Army-Navy was like the 11th highest-rated football game of the season. And granted, those two teams, I mean, those are the best records those schools have put up combined in like 30 years. But a big factor is it's the only game on that weekend. I think the TV networks and the power players, they have their eye on playing 4 more playoff games there. I think we're going to 16, and the argument about the buys will go away because the buys will go away, and they can just rank the teams. They're gonna put 4 playoff games on that weekend.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the big piece is, though, too, is that if we did get those first-round games, like, they would probably be happening around the same time as the ones that are happening this weekend, because you'd want the games to happen around the same time. I think how they distributed that would be really interesting. Like, right now, we are in a position where there's going to be 1 Friday night game and 1 during each window. I think that probably if we move to 16 and there are 8 first-round games, we're probably stacking these a little more. There probably will be conflicting games. And look, we'll have to kind of figure out what exactly ESPN and also TNT, who's going to have a part in this heading forward as well, want. But I do think that we probably are moving to at least 14 in 2026 with at least 1 more first-round game. But again, I think that I'm still hesitant to write anything too firmly in stone until we actually get to play these games.
Shehan, we appreciate it as always. Thanks for joining us. Love having you on.
Thank you so much for having me.